This video will give you some guidance on how to get going when setting up a glossary with Axon. First up, what is a glossary? It's a reliable, managed list of terms to use in an organization, and it's going to help your users understand definitions, bring them together to see a common language, and start using the same terminology to avoid misunderstandings and get them on the same page. It may be called various different things, i.e. data glossary, business glossary, data dictionary, etc. The first aim will be to find everything you have, the little bits and pieces across the organization, and bring them together. So, getting started. First, as I say, you've got to locate the existing glossary items. Likelihood is there'll be something out there, bits and pieces of data definitions or data dictionaries that you want to bring together. Once you've begun to do that, you want to find their owners. Refine who the glossary stakeholders are who should have a say in structuring your glossary and in your definitions. For instance, if you are looking to define a bunch of personally identifiable information items for GDPR, you want to make sure the GDPR team are included. Then you want to hold a glossary workshop. This is where you bring people together before actually necessarily loading anything into Axon. Once you get going, you are going to be able to maintain your glossary in Axon, but it's worth having this initial workshop to do a few things. You want to, for instance, agree a broad hierarchical structure, more on that in a minute, and then focus in on a specific branch which you can go into in more depth. That will allow you the breadth of your platform so that you can bring in other definitions down the line, and also the depth to show value immediately in one area. To follow through on that GDPR example, it might be personal data that you flesh out first. Then you can start planning who else to involve, how and when. Once you're showing that Axon has value for the glossary within a certain branch, you can then start talking about involving other SMEs and building out other areas. As you go, you should be addressing challenges one at a time and iterating, so building up the glossary and learning from your mistakes or issues. General tips before we get going. When you're thinking about what to include in your glossary, you should make sure it's something that needs to be explained to the wider community. Not everything in your data dictionary is necessarily going to go into your glossary. For instance, a bunch of different flags, which may have very important meanings to the techies who are using them, may not need to be defined for the business audience. So we can leave some things out. Does the definition need to be refined? So think about when you're reviewing your glossary terms, think about whether or not you need to refine the definition itself to make it easy to understand. Don't use any technical jargon if you can avoid it. Just explain things in clear, simple terms. Deduplicate. This is an important point. If you're bringing together multiple different pieces of different glossaries, you're going to want to deduplicate. Sometimes there will be actual duplicates that you need to work out the relevant context for, so you need to explain different terms. We'll explain more about how to do that in a minute. And sometimes you actually are explaining the same thing, but you call it different things. And that can be done with an alias, which we will also talk more about. Deduplication is important because if you have duplicates of the same concept in two different places in your glossary, you're going to create confusion and it's going to cause problems for maintenance as well. Finally, group similar concepts together. So when you start thinking about building up your hierarchy, you want to group things together logically so that people can easily find the things that are relevant to them. We'll talk more about that in the next section. Tips on hierarchy. First up, glossary types can be used to help build hierarchy. The defaults that we come with out of the box are domain, entity, and term. You can see here we've got personal data as an example of a domain, with entities such as legal information and identification data, amongst others, that there would be within that domain. And then under those entities, you can also expand those to see specific terms, for instance, full name, gender, age, etc. This is a hierarchical structure, domain at the top, entity beneath, and term at the bottom. You can have multiple layers of domains or entities or terms as well. It does not just have to be one of each, but that is how you build up your hierarchy. If you begin, choose broad domains when you're beginning to plan your hierarchy. So things like market data, organization data, party data. These are going to allow you to slot additional terms that come later into existing domains. So if you choose a broad range that's going to give you as much coverage as possible, you'll have less problems down the line. Also, choose relatively generic entities at the second level to provide some entity structure beneath those domains. So we've taken the example here of arrangement data, and underneath it there is arrangement identifiers, arrangement descriptors, arrangement data classifications, so on and so forth. That's again going to help you be able to have that broad coverage to slot in later terms. Choose more specific entities within these where necessary. So for instance, this is what I mentioned earlier about having not always just one level of an entity, but within lifestyles and interests, you might have another category below that of leisure activities and interests and consumption habits. So you can have multiple layers in this hierarchical structure. Then you can slot terms into their most appropriate home. So you can see here that we have the ability to use horizontal relationships to connect items, not just via their hierarchy, but also to other things they're related to. For instance, height is a personal characteristic, but it's also being used in segmentation information. So we've connected it as being a component in that. So this is the ability to build more relationships than just hierarchical, so don't feel too limited by the fact that you only have one parent per item. A few common use cases and how to address them. First up, multiple names for the same term or to support multi-language search. For instance, some terms just have more than one name. So if you call a customer and somebody else calls it a client, you can add this as an alias. This means that whichever of these terms you search on, you will be brought to the same object. This can also be used in the context of language support. So if you have multilingual users, you can add different alias names of the translated name to get you to land on the same page. Requirement to relate a glossary term to more than just its parent. So we touched on this on the last slide, but here is an example. We might have the concept of address defined and also corporate address, so maybe a personal and a corporate address. They are made up of the same items. So one of them might be the parent to things like city, country, county, postal code, etc. But both of them are linked to it. Both of these terms we can see have been linked via horizontal relationships to these concepts. So that's an example of how we can use horizontal relationships to go beyond just the hierarchical view. The same term meaning different things in different contexts. This can happen. We sometimes have a term like collateral, which in the loan world means one thing, but for a family, it means something quite different. Now, it's okay to just call this collateral because you will always know the context it is in because of the hierarchy. When you see it, when you're making connections to it from other facets, for instance, it will have its parent in brackets to give you a clue as to where it belongs. So this is okay. Don't be so scared of duplicates when there's a genuine need for duplicate as to avoid them. Just make sure they're in the context that they need to be in. Relating business terms to their technical counterparts. Finally, there's an example here. When you're defining things in Axon, like date of birth, you want to call it date of birth or birth date. That's a good glossary term, as we can see here. But the attribute name may be slightly different, slightly more specific to a field, and the database field name could be something really very technical. In this case, it's still understandable, D_O_B, but what we're doing here is relating it to a business term, so you can actually use the database field name that it appears in the table, the title of the column, so that everybody can come in from their own perspective, know what they call it, and then relate back to the common understanding because of the link to the glossary. So technical terms do have their place in Axon, but it's not in the glossary itself. It's either in the attribute name or the database field name. Okay, thank you very much.